It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Riddell.
That's okay.
Who is going to give interesting talk about changing roles in science. And Brian he earned his bachelor at the University of Guelph in 1974 and then did PhD at the McGill University dedicated to Salmon biology and genetics. So he was doing this work for a very long time, and after this for about 30 years, he was working mostly with DFO, with the government institutions in different research and managerial positions. And his field of research focused on salmon population biology, genetics, but also international fisheries management and formulation of science-based policy for conservation and utilization of these iconic species. A few things to mention: he was a scientific lead in the creation of Canada policy for conservation of wild Pacific salmon, and he contributed heavily to the development of the Pacific Salmon Treaty between Canada and the United States, a treaty, bilateral treaty, which is governing management, research, and enhancement of the Pacific salmon. Brian is internationally recognized fisheries scientist and very passionate talker, so hopefully you're going to see this today. But he took all this, passion and love to salmon and into creating and becoming CEO of and president of the Pacific Salmon Foundation, which was created in 1987, but he joined it in 2009. This is an independent non-government organization dedicated to creating a suitable future for wild salmon and their habitat. And it operates at a very decent annual budget. It's really a big achievement, which is then multiplied many times by in-kind contributions. And what it does, it just makes grants to community-based salmon conservation projects in British Columbia, and actually to universities. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Evgeny. Well, when Rashid phoned and asked me to give a talk, I said, well, Rashid, I don't do a lot of science anymore. And so his advice was, well, just talk about what you do. And I didn't think that'd be overly stimulating, but I'm going to start there. And then really, I think a lot of the information will be more for the, for the students in the sense that, as I'll show you with my titles to come, a lot of what I've had to do over 40 years is communicate. And I don't know if anybody in university has taken a communication course. You talk in any way about, you talk about writing, you do writing, but a lot of the communication you do is not. It's verbal, and you get a single shot and you go on from there. So the other thing I can say is that, well, Ralph, love to see you. If you get into some of these debates, the ratio of conflict to progress is about 5 to 1. Right? Change is not fast, and it's not pretty. Right? So I'm not going to dwell on this sort of thing, because then what I want to really get to is some of the aids that you can use in communication, and then what I think we really have to focus on in the future, because I don't think there's any point in time in my career when trying to interact with government has been more difficult. I think the Conservative government did much more damage than they were aware of. I'm not sure the environmental aspect even enters into the provincial agenda. We were just over there, and they were all very polite and didn't say anything about the environment or salmon once in 2 days. Right? So we have a long way to go in terms of really influencing government and anything to do with change. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to really start with my background, and then I'm going to actually go from there into some ideas about effective communication that I've learned, and then some concerns about where we're going in the future. And really, I'd like this to be more of a dialogue than a lecture, but we'll get through this and then we can have a discussion. Well, as I just said, my background was from McGill University, trained as a scientist, came out to do a postdoc and didn't do that, ended up in a job without any sort of lead up to it. And since then, it's been kind of a run. there's been a lot going on. So the alternative titles is sort of a thing like, it's not science so much as changing, but our role in science. I think science is progressing at a rate and leaps and bounds that the public does not understand. The gap between scientists and public communication is probably getting bigger and bigger. Yes, people are better educated, but when you're making major fundamental changes in how we do things, the understanding of that is not always very good, right? And so we really have to do a little better job in that. So my career was in science communications, conflict and advisory roles, but really the message is that you're not trained in this stuff. This is run and learn as you go, right? So this is what maybe I'll try and assist with in some way. Certainly conflict resolution was where I had to learn more than anything else. I tell my mother that she's been called many, many bad names. And that, but you sort of have to put that aside and just keep on going. And policy development is a totally interesting area. And this is where you can influence government, right? But I'm sure nobody's taken a policy development course either. Does such a thing exist? I'm looking to you because you're the only sociologist I know.
We're trying to have a program in it, but we're not very good at it.
All right, well, maybe you'll learn something today.
Yeah.
Okay. Why is this not working? Well, I think the fortunate side of my career is, in the past 40 years, I don't think you could have been anywhere else in working in government than dealing with wild Pacific salmon and see so much change. I mean, it has been massive, the changes that we've made, right? And so this is just the ones that really came to mind as I went through here. So they're pretty self-explanatory. I'll run down the Salmon Enhancement Program, 1977. The discussion started in 1972. This program was stated to Treasury Board of Canada that you don't need to know anything else. Science is completely adequate. All you have to do is spend the money and we'll double the salmon catch. Hasn't happened, right? The catch is about 25% of the past. So why is nobody challenging that policy, that investment? That is the single largest departmental budget today. And back at that time, there was a lot more money, but it was $47 million a year when it came in. No science, no assessment until we insisted on the Code of Our Tag program. Right? Not a good story to start with. Conservation biology as a discipline really started in 1981 with the journal, and it did have a huge effect because it really now became a whole new discipline that people were talking about minimum population sizes. Salmon populations fluctuate a lot, right? So how do you actually cope with that? You've got production goals that we call the maximum sustained yield value for escapement, but you also have minimum population sizes where you have genetic concerns, right? So that was a whole new area. 82 was the first treaty that was trying to work between the United States and Canada. That had gone on since 1967, right? The first treaty between the United States and Canada was actually in 1892, because at that time, the sockeye coming through Puget Sound were taken in these huge trap nets, right? And there was no way to regulate those, and it was massively wasteful, right? Because you couldn't possibly process the catch in the old systems, right? So the debate with the U.S. goes back well over 100 years now. The Salmon Treaty itself was 1985, and that's the treaty that we continue to work under. 85 is also the first aquaculture site in BC, and everybody's probably aware that debate continues to go on. Maybe a little more specialized now, but just as problematic as it was back then. We went from one site in 1985 to 183 sites 4 years later. So you can imagine the explosive growth and the problems that that was generating. 1987, after the treaty, is when the Cowichan River over on Vancouver Island, the population return of Chinook there crashed. It went from 10 or 11,000 a year down to about 1,200, including the hatchery that was there. And that this is the first action that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans took to actually regulate ocean harvest of Chinook salmon. Before that, it was a small size limit and a season, but the season was very long. There was no area-specific management at all. There was no specific stock concern. And this was very, very contentious. Okay, so let's just run through the rest. the Biodiversity Convention definitely had a major effect. 1996, this was a very, very fun summer. So I had an RCMP officer come to our cabin on Hornby Island and take me away to spend a lovely month in the U.S. Supreme Court in Seattle, because my minister of the day volunteered me to be a friend for the Southern Tribes. And they were in a Supreme Court case with the state of Alaska. And this was the ugliest thing you could imagine. This is reality TV, right? And it was amazing what people would say on the stand, and then there would just be ongoing debates. But that was about as ugly as it gets, all right? And people literally were calling others names and so on. That was the low point of the U.S.-Canada relations, for certain, in the past while. However, the problem was that the source of this debate was very real. And I just want to show you this one graph. I don't have a lot of these. But this period in here really resulted in the crash of West Coast Vancouver Island Chinook to the point where my forecast was essentially no females returning to the major hatcheries or all the natural river systems along that coast. And of course, there are, I think, 27 First Nation communities dependent on that coastline, right? So there was no choice. The forecast basically said essentially no females. You were talking tens of females. And so my advice to the government was shut down the ocean fisheries. Problem is, over 50% of the overharvest is in Alaska. We have no way to regulate Alaska other than under the treaty, which wasn't going to be sufficient. So the southern tribes tried to take them to court to go beyond that under their ESA. And it didn't go that well because the judge wouldn't act on the information at hand. He simply sent us away to resolve it technically again. Very, very fortunately, because the court case went on so long, we ended up delaying the openings. We had no opening in Canada, first time in record. And Alaska helped a little bit. Otherwise, we would have had irreparable harm. And what happened then is even worse. Just the next couple of years were 3 years in a row where you ended up having terrible survival on the West Coast, and you went down to extremely small populations. So, and we're still recovering from this because we didn't take sufficient reductions in the ocean fisheries to protect those stocks, right? So that turned out to be a problem anyhow. This is different here though. So this is the largest Chinook hatchery in Canada. It's in Sprout Lake region. And these fish go all the way up the coast. They're taken up into Cook Inlet, but they're primarily harvested in southeast Alaska troll fisheries. But the other element is this point here. That's the 83 El Nino. And the occurrence of that in 1983 basically got the salmon treaty. It wasn't the wonderful negotiations that were going on. It was the reality that both countries had to cooperate to sustain fish in the future. If we had not, we would have done massive damage to the Chinook populations from pretty much central Oregon into central BC. Right? So that 1 year was sufficient to do it, and then of course the other part. But the other interesting point here is that if you look at when you get the low points, it's not one sudden point, is it? Right? We didn't seem to see any of that going on until we got down to this point. And then over here, you had these sort of crashes going on. And that's sure there are patterns, not as obvious, but you can see that decline over time here. So these events where we talk about El Nino as a single year event, not necessarily the case. Brian can probably jump in here too. But there's no question that we see lead-ups to these major events. And this is using photo-wire tags put into the fish's nose before they're released, and then we monitor them throughout all of the fisheries and then back to the escapements. Right, so very, very rich information source. Right, just finish up on some of these here. Of course, the big point in a lot of consultation was achieving Canada's wild salmon policy. This really was an accomplishment because this was a decade of consultation. We started in 1999 in formal consultation, but we fought for 2 or 3 years internally just to get agreement on what to present publicly and that. So this was a very structured process, and it really was give and take. We would take something out to the consultation group, we would get feedback from them, we'd go back and say, well, where can we go with this, how can we integrate it? and then we go back and forth and back and forth. And so apparently last night was a very low point in the arc of communication, because the Department of Fisheries and Ocean is consulting right now on how to implement the wild salmon policy going forward. I think they started this because of a really bad thing that happened, and that was the 2012 change to the Fisheries Act, and they're still trying to adjust to this. But what makes me sort of annoyed, to be honest, we already know that the recommendations from the government's recent review of the Fisheries Act is that the public is saying very strongly, put habitat protections back into the Fisheries Act. So this consultation is talking about, well, we're going to take it out of the wild salmon policy. So it's like one hand doesn't know what the other one's doing. And so people are obviously very confused, and they're very angry that the department is still talking about it. And apparently this really came out last night. I didn't go down to it, fortunately, but it didn't go very well. And then what I'll get back to later is, in 2008, I actually did leave the department and went to the foundation. And the fundamental change there has really been that the Pacific Salmon Foundation was a relatively low-key, supporting community organizations, a lot of freshwater activities, but we've really extended it out into the ocean with a couple of major programs, and I want to finish on some of that in terms of networking and collaboration. Now, what did all this actually mean? When I came out here in 1979, of course, there was all sorts of famous scientists that you read about in your training. There was no formalized stock assessment of salmon on the West Coast. I mean, not a little, but there was none. And the only exception was Fraser sockeye salmon, and that was because of the treaty, right? But it was a bit of a shock to actually come out and realize that where you assume that the state of stock assessment was in Canada was nowhere. So we've had to actually build that up from nothing since 1979. But this, as you start using the data, we immediately found that all coho salmon were significantly over-harvested. And so then we got into, as soon as we started analyzing data, we were cutting back fisheries. And so we went through a number of years in the early 80s where fishermen were saying, well, we're not going to give you quota wide tags because all you do is take our catch away. You use it to reduce our fishery. So, of course, you had to spend the whole time saying, well, if you don't, you're not going to have any fish. So if you want us to stay in your fishery, we've got to use the data and so on. So you get into some pretty strange arguments. Conservation came along and did the exact same thing, right? So again, we had to go down because we were talking about being below escapement targets. First Nation rights came along, they did the same thing again to ocean fisheries. And so there's a long history there of learning, implementing new things, but what's really done is had a disproportionate effect on ocean fisheries and particularly commercial fisheries. So the reductions in the commercial fisheries are far greater than they needed to be for the status of the stock. But as you learn how to manage these resources, you are reallocating what was available to other users as well, right? And I'm not saying that that's inappropriate, it's completely appropriate with the First Nations and that, but it was a huge change that you've had to go through in this time period. All right, now in terms of communicating some of these things, this is sort of one example I won't go through a lot of these. When we started talking about the wild salmon policy and we started talking about achieving conservation goals and so on, there was a lot of pushback because the way fisheries in Canada were managed is the industry was able to respond to the apparent abundance of the year. So what that was doing is having very high harvest rate in huge areas of mixed stocks. And so you had lots of situations where some stocks were over-harvested and some stocks were probably a little bit, but not so badly over-harvested. You were pushing the margin all the time, but the effect on stocks was not equal everywhere, right? So what I had to think of how to do is to get people thinking about the value of conserving local populations, and this is what really led to the wild salmon policy down the road. So I just came up with this really simple diagram. I deliberately inverted the triangle to emphasize that genetic diversity and production all start with one parent and one male and a female. Not quite right? One female, several males possibly. But the fact is, because it starts with a very local stream and local, very small population. And everything else builds up from there. And that is the wild salmon policy. The wild salmon policy is simply saying that you cannot have future production without protecting the habitat and without maintaining the connectivity between populations, what we call networks of salmon populations, right? And it just started from this simple diagram, and we used it all the way through the discussions. And that worst case, and probably a really heartfelt statement by a First Nation lady in Kamloops, and they had always had a traditional home along the stream. And she was very, very upset with me that you're not going to guarantee managing my stream. So I'm sort of thinking, well, this is not going to go well, because I have to tell her that whoever told you that lied, because the Department of Fish and Ocean never managed your stream, right? You looked after your habitat because it's your First Nation territory, and the Department of Fish and Ocean wouldn't have a clue in the world where your fish went, right? What we're doing is we're saying, reality is that your isolated stream doesn't have any long-term assurance unless you have a mixture going on with local populations as well, right? Any person in agricultural genetics will tell you that you have to manage the herd, you got to have genetic diversity in the herd. Salmon are no different, right? So if it's isolated and it's a small population, it will lose genetic diversity over time, right? It's only become less productive. While salmon policy takes that into account, because it manages geographic areas and allows the populations to mix on their own. Now, in all of this debate, one of the things that I will frequently do is use humor in discussions. And so I have a long file of political cartoons. I was thinking last night, though, that some of the humor to this is only for the old guys in the room, or girls, and that. Because this is the last West Coast fisheries minister. This is David Anderson from Victoria. And this man, who's upside down, he is short, though, the way he looks there. And that, of course, is, oh, jeez. Glenn Clark. Sorry, brain fart. Glenn Clark, who is the premier NDP, I think the last one, probably, going back.
Second to last.
Second to last? Isn't that interesting, though, that he now works for one of the biggest capitalists, because he's the sort of business manager for Jimmy Pattison. And what this is about is to get the Salmon Treaty renegotiated in 1999. Canada had almost no way to put pressure on Alaska. So the fishermen took it upon themselves. And so this is when they blockaded the Alaska ferry service. They used all their boats and they went out and they wouldn't let the ferry come into port. Well, to say that Mr. Clark was a little upset would be an understatement. And so these two never really got along. What I'll comment on a little bit later is something that was very useful that started from some of these debates, was something called the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council, a totally independent advisory group outside of government, to be funded half by the feds and half by the province. The half by the province never ever came about because of this cartoon. It became very personal and did have a major effect. Now this is a little bit of humor because this happened completely by accident, and it was 2015, the federal government, which was the Conservatives at the time, gave us $2 million to the Sailor Sea program, and another fellow that was sitting beside me, he didn't want a picture with the Premier either, so we were trying to find our way out of the Parliament buildings. We walked right into the room. So, now the humor to this is that my mother absolutely hates him. And so I made a picture of it and I sent it back to her. My sister says that she will only have it up when I'm home, and other than that it's always down on the mantle. It's never facing up. So, okay. So let's get to maybe, this is the message point, I guess. When you're actually communicating with different groups, I've learned you have to take a different tact, right? So not all communication is really going to be equal. And to me, there's really 5 major groups that I've had to deal with and may help to sort of think about in your future context. The public, of course, the single major point there is simple, clear messages, right? And I would start with the very end point of what you're saying so that people see how you're building up to that, right? So the public is one that you can learn about pretty easily. Media and internet is not your friend in communication, right? Because everybody's equal, right? And this has had a number of problems, even for the Salmon Foundation. But I would not want to deal with this in DFO anymore. So media is clearly a challenge. I would say it's not more than 50-50 if I think that an interview with the media has actually accurately represented what I've said. This is not working, right?
You can turn it off.
Don't worry.
It's
Right.
fine.
It's all right, we go back and forth. Right, so that is one where I would even say you take media consultation training. The Department of Fisheries and Ocean has been burned so many times that that's compulsory training. Right, wouldn't hurt you if you're in science, learn what the pitfalls are, and that stuff is available. Politicians. Well, this is a challenge and a half. The fundamental difference I realize with politicians is that their vision is much shorter than mine. Right? They're talking about 4 and 5 year steps. They may be around 2 on average terms. And what was extremely apparent when I started with the Salmon Foundation is they saw salmon as a problem. They did not want to talk about salmon. They didn't see any real value to them. It was a long-term issue, and they would rather talk about salmon disappearing than how it's going to really benefit me being elected again. It is very much an individual trait of, it's not the right way to say it, how you deal with them becomes very much an individual person sort of interaction. We have a very strong spokesperson right now with Pamela Goldsmith-Jones in West Vancouver. And she is actually making significant steps in Ottawa, I understand. So that's one where you really, really have to understand the person and his or her interests in that. So it is a tough one. First Nations is probably the biggest issue that I ever had in learning how to actually relate to First Nations. The single biggest thing I would say about First Nations is speak to them at their local region. The Salmon Foundation has done a lot of work in the Skeena. So we spend a lot of time interacting with First Nations in the Skeena. We do not talk about Southern BC. We won't even say the term anymore. Because many of them will say, well, you're from the South. We don't want to talk to you. Right? You have to really relate to place, as they talk about. And you certainly have to understand the respect for their elders. 2 fundamental points, place and respect. Right? Other than that, they're wonderful people to deal with. I think the most surprising thing to me is their sense of humor. It's great to talk to some of these people, and they're very, very outgoing. One that, if you get into an NGO, you'll be talking about networking and donors, with Eric being sitting here as a donor. And that, what will I say about Eric? This is just another sort of field that you got to talk about in terms of mutual values, particular personal interests, and that. But this is something coming out of DFO where you get your money from either applying to granting agencies or given to you from the government. You don't spend a lot of time doing that stuff. So this was an area where I had to learn a lot when I got outside. And then it's sort of, what do I think about when I'm dealing in communications? Well, it came down to sort of 7 things as I really thought about this. We've talked about the clear messaging, and a couple of examples I want to show you here about, sometimes things are very complicated, but you can make it really simple using analogs or models or pictures, right? So, whoops. In the Salmon Foundation, we do a lot of what we call informatics. So we go and we talk to a art group, and we'll say, well, this is the story, this is the issue, these are the debates. And they'll come up with things on the top here about, we want to restore habitat in BC. We've used this in a wide variety of activities. The one at the bottom is, it was interesting how this evolved because this is what we call salmon genes. And the reason we got into this discussion at all is working with Dr. Miller at the biological station in dealing in our Salmon Strategic Health Initiative. We're talking about applying genomics of salmon to understand the risk of wild salmon, hatchery salmon, and aquaculture salmon in disease transmission. So we're talking about pathogens, and we're talking about genomic tools that have come out of the Human Genome Program. Surprisingly, this actually got the point across really, really simply. We talked to our art people one time for a couple of hours, and this came back in about 2 minutes later. So a really simple model. The only other one I show you here is one that I thought was a gamble when I first used it, but it's amazing how effective it is in getting issues across. Keep blowing my slides here. Everybody's had a Rubik's Cube, right? Right? How many people have ever actually solved one? Right? Okay, now the trick is Did you scramble it and were you able to ever solve it again? You did? Well, you're one of the only people who've ever admitted that. All right, so I use this to represent a whole bunch of things, including forecasting. Because the issue with forecasting is, lots of people say, you guys have been studying this stuff forever, why can't you forecast 1 year out? It's because it's not the same, right? All the interactions have to happen again next year, so there's just as much uncertainty next year as there is 2 or 3 years down the road, probably a little bit less. But this really works if you're talking about complexity in ecosystems, what does uncertainty mean to people, and I'm giving you the forecast. For some reason, this appeals, but I think it's because people have used it. They've tried it. They understand how tough this is, right? And the point is, if you can solve it, it doesn't mean that you're going to do any better next year, or the next day, for that matter, right? And here's the humor side of the game. So many of you probably won't recognize Gail Shea. Lovely lady, really lovely lady. She was about 5'0" from PEI, a grandmother, and they gave her the job in the Conservative government as the Minister of Fisheries. What a cruel thing to do to a nice person. 2009 was the Cohen Commission because what? Worst return of sockeye salmon seen, way below forecast. And this lady was given the task of making this thing work. But what happened in 2010, right? And this, of course, is a wonderful story because it came back as a 100-year high. So a 100-year low to a 100-year high, 1 year difference going up into the exact same environment and no different in the environment that winter, between the winters. How? Right? But I love this picture because A, it's a really good picture of Gail. And the other side is she has the little fish earrings on and everything else. So it makes the picture to you right away, right? As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words sort of thing. So humor can be really good to use. Just want to get back to the other thing. Now the issue with humor is to know when to use it. If you use it at the right time, it can be really insulting because you might be indicating that you're not taking something that somebody says seriously, right? So be selective, but it's very effective at reducing stress levels. Everybody talks about listening. I had to learn this, right? Because you think you know what's going on. You know the data better than anybody else you're talking to. But sometimes it's not about data. It's just about something that they don't believe or some other issue. And it can go anywhere. It's amazing how many times you can be talking about a particular thing and somebody brings something completely out of the blue, and how do you relate that, right? The trick is don't get into a debate, right? Because they're expressing their real feelings in that. So it's a discussion that continues. Talked about using local examples, humor, and don't take it personally. I can assure you that's not easy at times, right? Particularly when they start talking about your mother, right? But it's not personal. And you just have to get above that and stay focused, stay polite. And then the other part is, and this has happened a couple of times, because you get into a heated discussion and you don't know every single answer. And so you have to make a commitment that we'll get back to you with this and so on. Boy, you got to do it. Don't say you'll get back to them if you're not going to do it, right? Because I've heard about that a few times. And it's not that you intentionally necessarily, but you don't write every single thing down, and it can come back to hurt you. And one thing that I've told my staff constantly, because you're dealing as the information source, above everything else, you have to have the integrity to report what the science is saying, what the analysis is saying, what's the assessment, and that. Don't exaggerate your understanding, because that'll come back. But you have to really have a very strong sense of integrity, and that will get you through most debates, right? And you'll be challenged by a lot of politicians that come back and say, well, why would you say that? That's not along our particular policy at times. But in thinking about what to really pass on to you, I mean, I think these are the key elements. I have learned some of these the hard way, but overall, it's actually been really fascinating. Now, these sorts of things really, really hurt, and I think this is getting to the end here now, and what I really see as your future challenges. When probably the best communicator in science in Canada for sure is David Suzuki. I mean, I can't believe it. I think his first TV show was 71, right? Somebody just told me that the other day. And, you know, I think as a communicator in science, people would probably come up with his name right away. So this sort of presentation is really tough to explain to people. And then you got the National Geographic, which is probably worldwide one of the best magazines in the world, without question. And that, but when they start actually recognizing war on science, this sort of thing, that's a serious problem. And that really indicates to us that we're not necessarily being all that effective. Look at climate change. I guess we got Trump last night again, right? He's going to take all the money from the EPA, and doesn't believe in climate change. He's going to reduce the money there. I think the quote was, all the money we spent in the last decade has been wasted, right? That's not speaking well for the U.S. in terms of what we're going to do under climate change. It'll be a challenge for Canada, because Canada has said many times that they will follow the sort of example set by Obama in the past, right? So hopefully they're not going to continue with that, because that won't be good for any of the science or any of the adaptation to climate change. Keep jumping this. Okay, so here's the sort of last two issues or slides. This would be my sort of summary of where we're at. I think the issue with science specialization going on is going to continue. It's good. We're making huge advancements in many of the sciences. The problem here is I think there's some skepticism in the public on this. There is increasingly concern about the objectivity in decisions that governments are making. Come back to that. Climate change is going to change everything. I still have two people telling me that climate's not really having an effect. It is, absolutely. It always has. The difference is that there's a trend now. So a lot of what we've learned in the past is really we have to keep up that process and monitoring what's going on, because it is going to have a major effect in BC on Pacific salmon, and it's happening right now. Managing people is, that's why I'm talking about communication. Managing people really is about, managing salmon is about managing people, right? You don't debate with many salmon, right? But the truth of the matter is everybody has an opinion, and a lot of it reflects their background, where they live, particular issues in their community. And I think one that is increasingly problematic for us is, I don't honestly see a lot of leadership in this anymore. And somehow I think we have to reestablish this. And I think that some of this is that people are really challenged by how you communicate with government, right? And I'll give you a solution, well, potential solution that I've seen with this. So these are the sort of environmental situations that I talked about with PSF. How do we actually deal with some of these things? Where is the Salmon Foundation going to go? How do we provide leadership in the future? Right? I think to get the issue of the communication side and getting people involved and engaged in the science again, it's getting it down to local areas and local groups and that. So one thing that even the provincial government in the Watershed Sustainability Act notes is the opportunity to use watershed governance at a local scale. I think this would actually be a major step forward. You get local people engaged in the decisions that they're contributing to that they have to live with. They'll work it out, right? Right now, there is not really any indication that people would take advice from watershed governance groups like this. There's small examples. Even the Cowichan River, which probably is the best established example like this for water, it's not really effective. We know what the problems are, but we can't get to the solution. Right? So I think you really have to start dealing on a local area with local pressure points and issues that they have to deal with. Now, the independent expert advisory process, this was something that I think has really not ever gotten credit for what it did. This was formed in 1998. Your esteemed Dr. Walters was one of the original members. And it was called the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council. The Honorable John Fraser was the first chair. And its role, there were 8 people, its role was to sort of communicate with the public, and you had direct advisory to the Minister of Fisheries and to the Minister in the province. All right? I forget what department it was back then. And This was a group that had, I went as the science advisor for 3 years, but you had money given to it so that they would use external advisors as well. They produced 85 advisory documents in 10 years. Right? You're not going to find too many other organizations that have a productivity like that. And it was because they could tackle issues of the day, and they would take various ways. They'd have workshops, or they'd go out and meet with community groups and get public feedback. They took on major topics. What does BC want to see for aquaculture development in the future? A very good document that we wrote, never even looked at. Had no effect. And so this kind of broke down on its own because they were doing a lot of work in that, but they weren't getting any engagement. They would go and they would meet and they'd have the discussion, but they didn't really see anything coming back from any of these things. But the process worked. There wasn't the interaction with the government that they have to really resolve in that. But 85 documents in 10 years and all of pretty high quality, you're not going to find others that have that sort of record. So this type of process can't work. And then, of course, with the Salmon Foundation, one of the messages that we try to get across is we have to put salmon back on a level of importance that they take it seriously. And there's no better metric in my mind in looking at the developmental effects or climate change effects than on Pacific salmon. The reason for that is, of course, they use the fresh water, they use the near shore, they use the ocean and back. And they're spread throughout 3/4 of the province, right? Well, I chuckle, my son is the conservation officer for the Northeast, and that, so they have no salmon there, so we can talk. Right, so, right, now issues. Now, the first one may be a surprise to you, but I think one of the examples of science, communication, and development is hatcheries. There's some wonderful research going on in the US about genetic effects in hatchery programs, and they're essentially all negative. They are exactly what we have talked about for 30 years and now can demonstrate, right? Canada's not doing any of this until 2 years ago, Epic, yeah. So I met Ralph because we were working on the social side of a major program about coho salmon in southern BC. And they're looking at genetic diversity of coho salmon in southern British Columbia, and they're studying the effect of hatcheries on the genetic diversity of coho salmon. All right. First real solid example of somebody really looking at what's going on. This is our largest piece of resources in fisheries, $28 million still, and where they're sustaining their money, the resources going into stock assessment of wild salmon has been cut by over half. People and funding, right? Hatcheries are a huge drain that are not contributing fish the way they were assumed to. So we have to address this. We talk about climate change a lot, but there's actually, to my knowledge, none in terms of an actual action plan for climate change. Right. So I think we really have to get to this. A really simple example, I'm writing a chapter for the North Pacific Commission on Chinook salmon. Now, as I was working on it, there's a lot of interesting work in the States about estuary reconstruction. And I started to realize that the way we have estuaries limited now, as climate change goes on and the sea level rises, there won't be any estuaries. There'll be, shallow water along the shoreline, but there's not going to be actually many functioning estuaries, even in the Fraser, the way it's contained. So this is not something that is just maybe going to happen. This will happen, right? In which case you will drop the productivity of our larger Chinook populations immediately, right? No point in talking about orcas anymore, because that's about half their food. So we really have to get to this. And then the networking and collaboration. We were talking to Ottawa last week about the Ocean Protection Plan monies. Is there a process and how they're going to allocate it? The only thing they wanted to talk about was partnerships. And this is really, from their perspective, where partners can bring in-kind contribution and vessels and people and funds to it. But they don't want to do anything without having guaranteed partnerships. I support networking and collaboration. That's how we built the Sail of Sea program. But these are not easy, and not everybody has the same objectives, right? So as much as I think that these are great opportunities, they are not without challenges, right? So just wanted to show you, there's our network for the Sail of Sea Marine Survival Program. So I think it's 62 groups that contribute resources to do the program or contribute people to do the science. Networking can't work. We're in the 4th year of our major Sailor Steep program with all the networks and all the investigators. There's 155 scientists and biologists involved and funded through that program, and we're on track with every project. So it's so far an amazing example of collaboration. But these are not without the challenge of actually getting it together. Get to the end. Anybody know who Ray Troll is? Right? I met Ray Troll. In the beginning, I had the Northern Tagging Program. So I'm standing on a dock in 1982 in Ketchikan. And this little guy who, he's just standing around. He said he'd just come off the boat and he'd just gone up there because his brother ran a fish shop. Turns out it's Ray Troll. So we've been friends since that time. Just think what it would mean for the profile of salmon if Ray came down and painted a bunch of buses. Right? Aquarium does it, why can't we do it? So I'm suggesting to the Salmon Foundation that let's get with it. Let's paint 20 or 30 buses. We'll have a message on the back, and people will be aware of the value of salmon to BC. You got to start somewhere. And Ray is the most creative artist I've ever seen. I mean, he is great. But he's doing this in Ketchikan, so surely we can find money to do this in Vancouver. Right? He does a bus in a day. Right? So he has this down to an art. I think this, I did this because I was hoping Andrew would be around. So I have one marine mammal slide here. This, of course, is the central focus of Ocean Protection Plan. The only ecological indicator for $1 billion investment is the southern resident orcas. Right? So our pitch back to Ottawa was exactly this. This is the Seattle Times, it's not us. Right? The bottom line here is you can talk about noise and everything else, but if they don't have food, they aren't going to survive. They're not going to actually be reproducing. So you got to tie this all back together. So some of the media people are our friends, but you got to culture that, and so we'll be working on this element as well. Okay, so that's it. I love this picture to end. Mind its own. I love this because really it does sort of encapsulate the value of salmon in BC. This is done by EcoTrust Oregon by a young artist who was just starting out. It's not a great salmon, but I love the overall presentation, right? We've tested this on kids at the Adams River return. They get it instantly. There's no hesitation, right? So these sort of images really can go a long, long way. And if you can find images like this in your specialty that you can work with, it really helps any aspect of communication. So hopefully there was something useful in all this, and take questions where we want.
Thank you, Brian. We have about 5 minutes, so please ask questions.
Sorry?
Yes, thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. I have one quick note and I guess a question. The note is that I really like the first point that you had in the green box at the end about essentially community-based management in the north, which we often advocate in the south. And so it's really nice to see that it actually also applies here.
Yeah, I think it's really something that we have to put in place. We go around to 345 communities in BC. That's how many groups we fund. And we just get negative feedback all the time. Not for us, because we're there with them, but there's a huge frustration in trying to communicate with government. Right? A lot of people simply think the bureaucracy is running and their local knowledge is not going anywhere. And this is probably the frustration First Nations have felt for years and years. Right.
And so the quick question to follow up on that is that there was recently just a case that came through in New Zealand where the Wanganui River was declared like actually a living entity, which is quite phenomenal after 140 years. And so I was wondering whether you, in the case or in the context of the lady who was talking about her river, whether you think such a case could be made in Canada.
That's a really good point. We right now are trying to have the Harrison River turned into a national park. It has all 7 species of Pacific salmon. It's not common that happens. And it probably has 11 or 12 variants of those 7 because of the different run timings and that. And the pushback we're getting right now is that they don't need any more parks. We have every ecosystem in BC is covered by parks. And it's just ludicrous, right? So, but it's a very similar idea. It's so close to Vancouver. We build an education center. You've got all the facilities you need. And that.
Sorry, we have an exam.
Okay. So what you have to do is really just push it locally with government.
So you guys